Now let's look at another aspect of resource constraints. In this case, we assume we don't have enough resources to get the job done, unlike the previous example. So if we don't have enough resources to get the job done, then how do we apply them? What principles do we use to apply resources to activities in the schedule? There are three rules of thumb that are used, and the term heuristics is presented here in the text. Heuristics just means rules of thumb, rules to live by. So if you have more activities than you do resources to carry them out, you do three things. You first assign resources to activities with the minimum slack. And the reason for that should be clear. The less slack an activity has, the more it's likely to slip beyond its available slack and cause the entire project to be delayed. So you want to knock those out first. The next rule of thumb is to go to an activity that is the shortest in duration. Why do that? If you can get a couple of small hits out of the way, activities that don't take very long, you will quickly free up resources for other things. And often those other things are predecessors, so that helps you make progress faster. The final rule of thumb is if the first two don't apply or you've already considered them, the third thing to consider is the lowest activity number. And you could well ask, why would I worry about that? Well, the lowest activity number are early activities, and they probably precede late activities. So if you do them, then you will be able to start work on a successor. If you knock out a predecessor, you can then assign resources to a successor. So these are all tips for how you apply those resources. And the text gives examples of some common problems. Here is resources available. The maximum you have at the bottom of this chart is 3 people. And notice in the original schedule, if you assumed you had all the people you needed, you would have 2 people for periods from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2. It would jump up to 5, now down to 4, now down to 1. Well, you don't have those many people. Now you have to make some decisions. So what happens? Well, the very first thing that happens is you apply 2 people to activity 1. It requires 2 people, and it's the very first activity, and it has 0 slack, so that's where you'd put it. Okay, now you have 3 options once you've assigned resources to activity 1. You could assign resources to 2, 3, or 4. Well, if you look at activity 2, 3, and 4, notice that activity 2 has 0 slack. So if we return to those 3 rules of thumb, minimum slack, this means that activity 2 gets resources first. Okay, and then what's next? Well, this requires 2 people. Activity 4 is 1 person. Activity 2 is 2 people. If you assign 2 to activity 3, and the maximum you can assign is only 3 people, that means you only have 1 left over. So that means the next would be to assign to activity 4. So you could see this unfolding here on the bottom chart. You see 2 people have been assigned to activity 3, 1 person to activity 4, and you don't have enough for activity 2. So what happens? See this X? This means it gets pushed out. This is the exercise that a project manager typically goes through when assigning resources to a project when there's not enough resources. And as we see, what starts happening? The activities start getting pushed out. Now, if you try doing this in MS Project, where you assign more work than a resource is capable of doing based upon the number of hours in their calendar, well, you will see an alert that that resource is overallocated. Then you can do an automatic resource leveling. What happens? This is what happens behind the scenes in MS Project, and inevitably your project end date is going to be pushed out. And why is it pushed out? It's because of the lack of resources. And what MS Project is doing is these 3 rules of thumb to have a very rational approach to which activity should get resources first.